your lecture very, very much. But I was missing that you did not mention Glass-Steagall Act, one of the powerful instruments to cut the power of banks. It was introduced in 1933. You know it from Roosevelt. What's your position? What do you thinking about Glass-Steagall Act, Trennbankensystem?
Other, if you can get the mic to the here.
Hi, thanks. Gerald from JRC. Brilliant presentations. My question is then, a change is necessary. Who takes the lead to promote the change? If governments now with economic crisis are, of course, more interested in keeping employment, how does the change will be promoted in the near future, not in the long term?
Robin, did you want to? Yes. The first row, please.
Yes, I have a question for Lance Taylor. We had highly informative examples from Larry, and we also had likewise ones from Vienna, not quite as statistical, but indicating how you could have changes in what people do that did not appear to involve using extra energy. Now, yours fixed productivity related to energy seems to me to be naturally one in which one's looking at manufactured goods. And of course, with services and the other things, education was the star actually in Larry's one. Productivity and quality is notoriously difficult to measure. But is it really inevitable that we, in the sort of ways you have it, that the only way you would get the labour productivity with the new hedonic indices and so on, which have got huge faults, one can measure some of productivity growth from other things, and one could therefore not have quite such a pessimistic story. It involves even more dramatic mitigation. You have to stop going in for armaments. I think that was the worst on Larry's one. Going for these things that are less energy intensive, but that it seemed that yours was very much assuming all the growth in the future, which is a horrible story. It may well happen in China and India and so on, will go on cars. Just as an Egyptian doctor who was working for us said, well, when I go back to Cairo, I can't ride a bicycle as here. Nobody take me seriously. But that would change.
Yes, there is one contribution at the back. Can I?
Riham Red, British University in Egypt. I'm just asking, my question is to Professor Epstein. Whenever we talk about the financial crisis, we attribute the causes to the financial crisis, to relaxing regulations in the financial crisis. And we ignore the role played by the real economy. I mean, to what extent...
sorry, we just acoustically didn't hear just the last part.
Ignore the crucial role played by the real economy. I mean, to what extent, to what extent adjustment of real economy in terms of, for example, creating industrial policies that increase the production, consequently increasing income, provide the finance for investment, and this lead to decrease the blackmailing of the financial the blackmailing of financial sector to the government and strengthen the economy. This is my question. Thank you.
Yes, Luca Zamparelli, Sapienza University. Quick question for Lance Taylor. What about mitigation technology? Do you have any hope that there could be increases in productivity, either by learning by doing or by investment in that technology?
Do I see someone here? Yes.
Marc Lavoie from the University of Ottawa. I enjoyed all three presentations. I have a question for Sigrid Stagl. Well, it's more a comment than a question. I thought you were rather unfair for the Meadows report because you showed us those graphs that seem to give legitimacy to systems dynamics, being able to predict the future and all that, but isn't it true as well that the Meadows report was predicting that we would run out of oil by 2000 or 2010 and that we would be running out of iron ore or copper, uranium, and so on?
Mm-hmm. Other questions, comments? Anyone that Yes, Andy.
Thanks. Andrew Watt from the IMK. I also enjoyed all the presentations. I also enjoyed Lance Taylor's presentation. Although you disabused me of one idea that was dear to me, which is that watts are a good thing, and you've described quite clearly. Watts, you said, are a risk if the number of watts used per worker is increasing rather than decreasing. Happens to be my surname, so...
yeah. But not kilowatts.
Or even kilowatts, even worse. Simple question to you. It seems you did mention working time. You talked about the link between output, employment, and productivity in the real wage. I mean, I would imagine that it's not very difficult to amend what you said to have working time declining at the same rate as the rate that productivity is increasing and stabilizing output at low level, maintaining employment. Could you comment on that? How would that affect your findings?
Yes, Jan, third row, fourth, third.
I have a very short question to Lance Taylor. I enjoyed your presentation very much, but it was too much for me to follow. Like many others, couldn't see all the full screen. So I have one very little question, which is probably crucial. You mentioned the costs for mitigation. Is it constant over time? Is mitigation possible at all to the extent necessary? You just assumed, obviously, that mitigation can be done and that costs are constant, if I got it right. Maybe you can elaborate on that, because environmental economist Sigrid Stagl might object and might say it does not work and the pollution included in mitigation is increasing as well as a negative loophole effect, so to speak.
Is there anyone I have not noticed? Because if there's no one else, I would like to ask one question and give reference to something that might be interesting. When we are talking about managing with low growth but still achieving full employment, working time reduction, of course, it lies at the heart of that. I'm not sure whether it would be feasible or fair to talk about working time reduction without talking about redistribution as well. So obviously, if you are at the top 20% of the wage distribution, it's very attractive, or we can have a behavioral change to trade time for money. If you're below median, working time reduction should come with some sort of wage compensation. Okay, apparently you agree, so this was more what you think on that. But and the second is more a reference to a feminist economist, İpek İlkkaracan, who has recently coined a term, purple jobs. And it's, in a way, a policy that would tick many boxes ranging from gender equality to full employment with low growth, hence climate job, but also the care crisis. So their idea is to create more jobs in the care industry, child care, elderly care, jobs that are very labor intensive and also have very strong backward linkages to the rest of the economy. That also chimes, I think, nicely with the work that's being done at Perry, indicating that jobs generated in healthcare, education, generate a lot more further jobs compared to the military spending or oil industry. And I like this combination of purple and green jobs agenda, which also I think takes into consideration the issue of limits to growth. But you may say a few more things about how feasible is that to manage with low growth but generate purple and green jobs. Yes, yeah, here is Tom. Can we get the mic to the first row?
Tom Pally, the AFL-CIO. I would just like to try and link some of what Jerry said and what Lance said on the politics of this particularly. Jerry talked about the talk that's out there, and it's to sort of alert people to one of the issues that's developing, I think, about trading caps and trading permits. And of course, there's massive lobbying going on to hand them over to corporations who would then become the owners of those permits and trade it. Ingrid mentioned something about stranded costs. This is something that people haven't heard about, where that 2.8 trillion, what was the incredible number for?
27 trillion.
27 trillion fuel in the ground, resource, energy in the ground. Companies like Exxon are now working the scene lobbying to treat those in the same way that we treat in utility regulation. Unrecovered utility regulation is passed on in the form of electricity charge as a stranded cost. And there's now a whole language developing around that, that energy that gets kept in the ground will have to be compensated and purchased from the oil companies. Put those two together, and you get this incredible, massive transfer of wealth. And I think that that is a feature that needs to be included. It doesn't fit into the sort of wage profit share stuff because we know those have to be bounded. But there's also a wealth issue that is in the background that would be interesting to be included in these analyses.
Very good. Okay, I have two last contributions and I'll have to close. So the second row, please.
Well, Christoph Türk, student of economics. One question to Sigrid and Lawrence, because one thing I was missing by all this global view is just the fact that nowadays we have the fact that we are transferring our industrial production from the developed industrialized countries to China, where we do have quite a dirty industrial production. On the one hand, on the other hand, all the OECD countries are somehow like the top income earners if you go to the global scale. And what does this facts that we do have these huge global imbalances, inequalities, how does this fit into this thinking of global, global models?
And Armin, just it. Okay, thank you very much. They will help us to keep track of time. Shall we take the responses then in reverse order? Lance, would you like to start? If you could wrap it all up in 5 minutes, that would be great.
I lost my glasses. Well, let me try to respond.
I'll look for your glasses.
What? I have them here someplace. Let me try to respond to the questions as oh, I see. Okay, clever. They're supposed to be. Let me try to respond quickly to the questions as I understood them. On the issue of energy productivity and whether we can change the way we run our lives, more bicycles, less cars, that kind of thing. Yes. What? Oh, sorry. Energy, is it on?
Yes.
Okay. Energy productivity and sort of organization of lifestyle, certainly that's true, but there's a fairly complicated issue of brown versus green, which maybe I can illustrate in just one way. If you do a Google search, is it brown or green? Yeah, the answer is brown. I mean, if you look at the computer farms that Google is operating, and all the other big providers, that accounts for 2 or 3% of U.S. energy use right now, and so that superficially looks green, but in practice is pretty energy intensive, and so there are difficult issues that arise there. On mitigation, just a couple of observations. The technology certainly could lead to increasing returns to scale in the sense that you pursue mitigation more aggressively and you learn how to do it better. What we did in the model was, in fact, assume decreasing returns to mitigation, that it was sort of become less effective the more you did it. But it certainly could go either way. The issue of social change also enters into, obviously, working time. I mean, what I was calling the employment ratio was basically measured in bodies, but it also could be measured in terms of reduced working hours, which might then, in fact, feed into higher productivity growth. There are a number of complicated issues that arise there that have to be recognized. But, you know, if you're talking about 35, 60% reductions under business as usual, that would involve tremendous social changes and probably population loss also along Malthusian lines, which people have not really thought through. Sort of, I agree on cap and trade that's likely to be good excuse for speculation. Energy in the ground. The issue is whether you compensate is not so much whether you compensate Exxon, it's whether you compensate Saudi Arabia. I mean, they're the guys who own the energy in the ground, not Exxon. And so that then becomes a sort of international issue, which the Saudis may, in fact, pick up on, since they're pretty smart.
Okay, Sigrid.
Yep. Take the last question first. Relocation of production and deindustrialization of OECD countries. Yes, of course, poorer countries tend to have worse technologies and hence produce more carbon intense than richer countries. So we do see that. One approach that is taken is to change the accounting framework away from production to consumption. So if an iPhone is used in Germany, it should count for the material consumption and the CO2 emissions of Germany rather than of China. What's speaking against that is that it's more complicated to calculate that. Well, yes, we can put more effort into that, so we could do it. Another reason that's given against that is, well, the German consumer doesn't have a say over the technology that is being used in China. Well, I would question that, because if we don't buy the product, then, well, the Chinese producers will get the message and will use a different technology. So I would think that argument is understating the power of consumers. So yes, some change of accounting framework would help there, and the relocation, of course, helps the British CO2 emissions and help them achieve the Kyoto target. But for global environmental sustainability, it's detrimental. Yes. Purple jobs, good stuff. Yes, we need, of course, more of that. And in ecological economics, there's a lot of talk, as Lance has said several times, about the energy drive that's behind labor productivity. And at the same time, well, if energy becomes more scarce or more expensive, then, well, maybe in the long run we don't need to worry about unemployment anyways, because labor units won't be equipped as much with energy as they are at the moment, and hence we'll have to convert to a different labor regime anyways. That may be a happy scenario if it's managed, and, well, maybe if it leads towards more purple jobs, or it may be a very unhappy scenario. So again, we need the transition in a managed way rather than in a disastrous way. Working time reduction can only work with income redistribution. I would firmly agree with that. I thought it's such an obvious thing here that it doesn't need to be said. Another aspect that should also be mentioned with working time reduction, it doesn't automatically mean that environmental impacts would go down, because it depends a lot on what people do with the extra free time. If they sit down and read a book from the library, yes, of course, it does reduce the environmental impact. But if they save up and then do more of international flights and so on, which is very energy intense, of course, that could increase actually the environmental impact. So just labor time reduction by itself is not a strategy for a more sustainable economy. But of course, we can combine it with other measures. We need to combine it cleverly with redistribution of income and with environmental measures. Then it can work. Trying to respond to Marc Lavoie. Yes, limits to growth, of course, was far from perfect. It was a rather small team that did all the work. They had a massive endeavor. They underestimated the oil that was available, but to be honest, I would hope that they had been right in that regard, because all the new reserves that have been found are a problem for us. So yes, of course, there are it's not a precise analysis, but in the magnitude, it's amazing how right they were actually. The institute that I worked in for 4 years, SPRU, at the University of Sussex, criticized the limits to growth heavily, because they said, well, they're completely underestimating the power of innovation and technology. Yes, they did underestimate that, but that was built in. They decided to do so. Similarly, for example, prices of resources were kept stable. And of course, the economist's argument would be, well, if resources become more scarce, price will go up. But if we observe what's happening in reality, prices for resources are not a good reflection of scarcity. They are more a reflection of world economic power. And so I think, given the task, they did an amazing job in illustrating what they could expect at the time to happen. They failed poorly in influencing policy. And Dennis Meadows visited our university on Monday, and he's quite frustrated actually, which is quite sad to see. And he says now the sustainable development isn't possible anymore, so all we can do is just hope for adaptation and build towards that, and resilience is his goal now. So it's quite a frustrating story. I'm not so pessimistic as him. One last thing, tremendously difficult question: how will change be promoted? First, understanding what's going on and doing a socio-ecological economic analysis for making better suggestions for policies. I think that would be a first step. Second, every one of us doing our bit, but not just doing our bit in a personal realm, but also talk about it and engage in groups so that the change becomes bigger and amplifies.
Thank you very much, such as you also ended on such a positive note. Jerry, your response.
So thank you for the feedback and questions. So you asked about the Glass-Steagall Act. The Glass-Steagall Act separated investment from commercial banking in the U.S. in the 1930s. And it was a very important component of the financial regulation mechanism and set of institutions that led to a long period of stability. And there's the basic point, though, is that it limited gambling by large sections of the financial sector. And I think, so in that sense, I think the reimposition of something like the Glass-Steagall Act to limit gambling in the financial sector is very important, because gambling drives up asset bubbles, it leads to increases in leverage, and then when the bubbles collapse and the leverage is left, it generates economic crisis. But the problem is there's so many financial institutions now that can engage in this kind of destructive gambling. Hedge funds, private equity funds, and many others. So simply separating out a little core that we call commercial banking, because it produces, quote unquote, the money supply and will keep the payments mechanism somehow safe, is no longer sufficient, I don't think. So we need a modern kind of Glass-Steagall Act in the sense of limiting this destructive gambling. And there are many ideas out there. Some are in legislation, like the Volcker Rule is a helpful thing, and there are things in Europe as well. But we can't go, in my view, can't go back to a simple kind of Glass-Steagall Act for that reason. Then the question was asked about, aren't there real contradictions in the economy that led to the crisis and that we have to resolve? And yes, the answer is absolutely yes. And I think a lot of the kinds of policies that are talked about in this conference about industrial policy and restructuring the capital-labor relation, the things that we've talked about on this panel are important. So I'm sorry if I didn't mean to suggest that the only issues were financial. By no means are they. Including inequality is, of course, a key issue. To Tom's question, and the point about, oh no, excuse me, let me first go to the question about where should we start? I think that was your question over here. And I agree with what Sigrid said, which is that we start where you are, but not just in the personal sense. Start where you are in terms of pushing the policymakers in your realm to take action. We have to raise the cost of carbon, and that could be done in a number of ways, but that's the key. And we have to finance investments in alternative energy, and we have to start getting rid of the old canards like making this transition will reduce employment. The point of my talk was that, building on the work of my colleagues, that making this transition will actually generate employment. There isn't a trade-off between employment and this transition in the medium term, and we can worry about the long term later, because if we don't do it, there won't be any long term. I think that posing it as jobs versus the environment is the wrong way to do it. That was the point. But we have to have financing mechanisms, and we have to push our governments. The United States should start. It's the biggest user of greenhouse gases. It's put more in the atmosphere than anybody else. We should start, but everybody else should start too. But that gets to the point that Tom made about wealth in the ground and about stranded costs. I disagree with Lance. It's not just Saudi Arabia. There's a fossil fuel revolution going on now. It's fracking and tar sands and so forth, which is happening in the United States, in Canada, elsewhere. And these same energy and mining companies are finding new Saudi Arabias being created all over the world, getting property rights to these with trillions of dollars, as Sigrid said, in the ground. And this is the political economy point. They have massive incentive now to lobby against change, and they have the financial resources to do so, which makes our job a lot more difficult, but it makes our job all that much more important.
Thank you very much for ending with such a missionary statement for all of us. May I thank all the three speakers and also you for the contributions and the usual things.